great to be here. Thanks to Zipkate for bringing me. I should say that Jens is very much of a taskmaster. He made me do a full-day workshop today as a warm-up for this talk. So I've been going all day, so if everything goes as scheduled, I'll pass out just after I finish tonight. I should also say one of the things I really like about speaking in Germany is being able to have a beer while you speak. I'm thinking I should make it a requirement. The one other thing before I start is I like to walk around a lot when I talk, but I think my main objective tonight is not to fall off this little stage. So if I get too close to the edge, just scream. On that note, I should turn on my clicker. All right. So I run a consulting organization called Engineering IT in Minneapolis, back in the United States. It's north central, up near Canada. Apparently, if you watch Fargo on Netflix, you claim to know everything there is to know about Minnesota. You really don't, but that's okay. Our clients are large enterprises and small to medium-sized software as a service companies, and we help them deliver continuous value. And we really help them understand what it means to bring those three words together. My background is 30 years in IT. I have built systems and led organizations across the entire development, QA, and operations spectrum, so I have somewhat of a unique perspective on things like DevOps. But I have also been very strongly influenced by design thinking in general, and service design in particular. And when I think about new approaches to IT, whether it be IT as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, it occurs to me at least that service is really critical to everything that we do. And what interests me is not so much how do we design nicer enterprise user interfaces, so much as what happens when we start to apply design to IT itself, and beyond that, when we start to think about IT as a design activity. Because as software eats the world and as every company becomes a digital business, it's not enough anymore just to think in terms of aligning IT with the business. They really need to become one unified force for innovation. There was a bunch of conversation happening a while back about this new thing called the Chief Digital Officer. And there was this idea that somehow the CDO was going to replace the CIO. But I couldn't find anybody who could really explain what a CDO was and what was new or different or meaningful about it. Until I saw this really wonderful tweet, which basically said that the point of it was to increase the metabolic rate of the organization, to allow companies to change and adapt more quickly and continuously as organizations. In other words, with digital business, we're not just talking about delivering digital products, we're talking about being digital. A few days ago, one of GE's global executives published a really provocative article where she talked about this new thing called the emergent era. And she was basically saying that everything about our world, technology, business, economy, society, was in a different place and had a different set of rules. And she talked about Brexit, and she talked about Trump, and she talked about how these unexpected things happen out of the blue. And basically what she was talking about was coming straight out of complex systems theory. And she used this word emergence straight out of complex systems theory. And she talked about things like feedback loops. And she was basically saying that we need a completely new understanding in order to approach the world of the 21st century. So what I want to talk about is what is this new understanding and why is it that we need it? And to understand everything that's happening to us, we need to understand that we are living in a new world. We are moving out of the industrial world and into this new post-industrial economy and society. We've spent the last 250 years optimizing our ability to build and deliver and sell products at scale. You know, the thing about Henry Ford is he didn't actually invent the car. You know, supposedly Henry Ford said, well, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they'd tell me they wanted faster horses. He had nothing to do with innovation in terms of figuring out what a car should be. He was actually the fourth person to start a car company. His innovation was developing a mechanism to produce cars, which are very complicated objects, even back at the turn of the century, at very high volume, with very high quality, and cost effectively. He also supposedly said you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black. And whether he actually said that or not, the point of it was he understood that by reducing variability, he could increase scale and increase efficiency. And so as we developed this ability to make very large numbers of things, we had to have a new way to sell them. Because now you were selling to people you had never met and never would meet. And so along with the rise of industrial production goes the rise of industrial marketing, which peaked in the 20th century. And television was the perfect medium because it made it feasible for small numbers of large organizations to deliver a standardized, industrial, if you will, message to millions of people at a time. And to understand the industrial world, we have to understand the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was the father of scientific management. And his idea was that if you analyzed how you carried out industrial processes, and it might be something as simple as how do you carry a big heavy piece of pig iron from one side of the shop floor to the other side of the shop floor, and you figured out the optimal way to do it, you then used management to enforce that optimal way of doing it, and you maximized productivity. And in his mind, at least, because you were now comparing apples to apples, you could actually create harmony between workers and management. But from my perspective, the key thing to understand about Taylor was he had this notion of radically separating design and operations. That you would invest a large amount of time and energy up front to figure out what something should be and how it should be done, and then you would carry it out unchanged for as long as possible. And also, he believed very strongly that the people who did planning and design and management needed to be separate from the people who did implementation. But now we're moving into this new world that's no longer driven by products and instead is being driven by services. And that involves a shift from a focus on making things to a focus on delivering experiences that unfold over time. If you think about flying someplace, the actual time you spend sitting in your seat in the airplane may be a very small percentage of your overall trip that starts before you buy your ticket and doesn't really end until you get to your hotel. And along the way, you interact with a whole variety of systems and a whole variety of organizations. And your experience is the sum total of those. It involves a shift from momentary transactions. How do I get you to buy my sneakers? You bought my sneakers? Great, thank you very much. We're done until next time. Towards ongoing relationships where we judge the quality of a service provider by the entire history of our interactions with them. And finally, partly due to the nature of service and partly due to the fact that the internet and social media are tearing control over the marketing message away from vendors, marketing is becoming less and less about broadcasting and more about the ability to listen and understand and respond. And perhaps the most important thing about service is that how you make it is part of what you make. We can no longer separate those. I had an experience, and this may make no sense to you at all in Germany, as I assume your healthcare system is very different from ours. But in America, sometimes if you want a particular procedure or a particular device, you have to go through an authorization process where they decide whether or not they're going to pay for it before you can get it. So I had an experience where I needed an authorization, and I spent an entire month talking to my insurance company trying to get it authorized. And I was sent from Department A to Department B to Department C, back to Department A. And it got to the point where I could almost draw their org chart. And I could draw the divisions between their IT systems because I could tell that Department A had these two pieces of information about me, and Department B had two different pieces of information about me, and they were bouncing me back and forth because none of them had the whole picture. So all of the nooks and crannies and silos in their organization impacted my experience as their customer. Now, it used to be the case that it was fairly straightforward to know where you were at any point in your life. Were you at home? Were you at work? Were you alone or with your friends? Were you online or offline? But as service, and in particular digital service, becomes more and more pervasive, the lines between the parts of our lives are blending, and they're all infusing and mixing together with each other. So if I go to the coffee shop, am I going there to chat with my friends or work? If I pull out my phone, am I calling my mom? Am I uploading kitten pictures to the internet? Am I checking my work email? Is my car just a car, or is it really an incredibly complicated and sophisticated online music player? Well, the answer to all of these questions is yes. And this has the effect of taking us out of the familiar industrial world of complicated systems and into this new and unfamiliar world that Beth Comstock from GE refers to of complex systems. So if your car radio isn't working, whose fault is it? Is it Honda's fault? Is it Spotify's fault? Is it Verizon's fault? If you're trying to deal with a subscriber management problem on your customer-facing website, is that a system of engagement problem or a system of record problem? We have this idea these days that we can do bimodal IT, which is this notion that we can manage our new agile front-end systems and our old legacy back-end systems separately and differently and independently from each other. But the problem is that the business world is forcing them to interact more and more directly with each other. And so the boundaries don't work anymore. And if you're doing customer support, do your customers call you or email you on some private controlled channel? Or do they just complain on Twitter and Facebook and relegate you to just being another participant? Now, to explain exactly what I mean by these words, complicated and complex. Complicated systems are ones that may have a lot of moving parts, but we can organize and structure those parts, and we can understand and manage the relationships with them. So if you think about a car, very few of us anymore can fix or even understand how our cars work. But if we have a flat tire and the dealer tries to sell us a new fuel injector, we know that something's fishy, because we're able to understand that unless something catastrophic happens, like the car burns up, there's no direct connection between the fuel injector and the tires. And we can see these kinds of complicated systems in a lot of familiar environments. If you think about the traditional data center, we have at least the illusion that we can decompose it into nice pieces. And we've got power and cooling, and we've got network, and we've got database, and we've got operating systems, and we've got applications, and we have application A over here, and application B over there. And as long as each part runs properly, then the whole thing will run properly, is the belief. If you look at traditional organizational structures, it's similar. We have this org chart as a nice hierarchy. And the idea is that if I manage my group properly and you manage your group properly, the organization as a whole will work. Complex systems, on the other hand, are the kinds of things that we find in nature and society. It could be anything from an ant colony to a flock of birds to a city to an entire economy. And what they are is they tend to be made up of relatively simple components that interact with each other in very dynamic and fluid and unconstrained ways. And again, we can see these in environments that we are encountering more and more. So if you look at what's happening to the data center, where all of a sudden it's full of microservices that are being developed by these little decoupled groups in a very decentralized fashion. If you think about integration between internal and external services, and public cloud and private cloud and shadow IT. We start to have these interactions between the pieces that just don't fit in the traditional hierarchical model. And again, if you look at new approaches to organizational behavior, whether it be holacracy or adhocracy or open source models of organization, they start to look much more complex and much less complicated. And interestingly, if you think about the challenges that management has faced for the last 100 years, you could say that it's a result of trying to apply a complicated system, machine-oriented approach to what's really complex behavior, which is human beings and human groups. The thing we have to understand about complexity and complex systems is they're very strange. They don't behave the way we're used to systems behaving. They are characterized by things like emergence, which is exactly what the GEVP was referring to. This is the idea that you can have order at a global level that has no explicit rules. The only rules are local ones. If you think about a flock of birds, there are no rules that specify how flocking works. You could even say that it's a figment of our imagination, that we see it but it's not really there. The only rules govern how individual birds interact with their immediate neighbors. And so on the one hand, it means that you can't directly control a flock. You can't go into your data center and say, hey, all you microservices, I want you to flock over here and flock over there. But on the other hand, it gives them a kind of flexibility and resilience that's very powerful. If a flock of birds is flying along and there's a cell phone tower or a tall building in the way, it happily splits itself into pieces and flies around it and glues itself back together again. Whereas if an airplane tries to do that, it breaks in half and falls to the ground and crashes. Now, on the one hand, we have this lovely resiliency. On the other hand, complex systems are subject to what's known as cascading failure. And this is the idea that you can have simple component-level failures that interact in catastrophic ways. You can even have situations where the components are behaving the way they're supposed to, but when they interact, failure emerges. Google had a major outage a while back, and when they did their nice root cause analysis on it, what they discovered was that an engineer had misconfigured a system. Now, we all are familiar with that, and we all know what we all say when we hear that. Human error, automated out of existence so the engineer can't mess up again. Well, in Google's case, they had a system that was designed specifically to detect and prevent that precise error. But because of an unrelated failure, that system was offline when it was needed. And finally, complex systems are subject to what's known as sensitivity to history or the butterfly effect. And this is the idea that whether or not a butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the world can impact whether or not there's a hurricane on the other side of the world. And what this means is that very small changes in initial conditions can result in very, very different outcomes. And what it means for us is that on some level, when we're trying to manage complex systems, it's not possible anymore to model or test them outside of production, which goes against everything we've learned. So the bottom line is that it isn't feasible to model or predict or control or even understand complex systems the way we're used to understanding complicated ones. And on the one hand, they have this wonderful sloppy resilience, and on the other hand, they exhibit unavoidable and unpredictable failure. And in fact, when you try and control complex systems too tightly, using the kinds of industrial control models we're used to, they have a tendency to flip from being sloppy but resilient into being brittle. And that's really where catastrophic failure comes from. So to make all of this more interesting, this is all happening in an environment of ever-accelerating disruption, where companies are competing by changing the rules, And product lines and entire business models are becoming obsolete more and more quickly. And companies are having to change their focus from trying to do the same thing better and better all the time to trying to figure out how to do something new all the time. Tesla is the poster child for the post-industrial company. They are not revolutionary because they make electric cars, or because they make electric cars that are fast and good-looking and have a long battery life. They're revolutionary because they fundamentally reimagined the experience of buying and owning a car. And they're unique in their ability to update their cars over the air in software. Jeep had a problem a year or so ago where they had a security vulnerability that would allow people to remotely hack into the car and shut it off while it was driving. And in order to get it fixed, you had to take your car into the dealership and leave it there. You don't do that with a Tesla. It gets directly updated over the air. And they can change things like suspension settings and battery life. In other words, they can change the physical characteristics of the car, which means that they've started to break down the separation between the physical and the virtual world. So if we think of a brand as a promise, a set of expectations of benefit that you have from interacting with the brand, the very nature of the brand promise is shifting away from this industrial era promise of stability and unchangeability. You know, I like my Honda because it's more or less the same now as it was when I bought it 11 years and 185,000 miles ago, in favor of this new post-industrial promise where the nature of the product or service continually changes in response to the customer's experience. So we're faced with a new business imperative. No longer can we approach business by trying to control our environment, controlling customer perception, controlling customer behavior, controlling employee behavior. Because now we have less and less control, and as a result, what we have to do instead is develop the ability to navigate environments that are uncertain and unknowable and continually changing and continually surprising us. And we have to shift our model from trying to broadcast our message and our product to actually collaboratively creating it with the market and with our customers. And finally, we have to shift our focus away from decomposing systems into their parts and instead think in terms of connecting the parts into greater wholes. And this all means that we have to rethink the Taylorist separation between design and operations. We have to start to interleave them to the point where they almost become one unified thing. Now, what do I mean when I say design? I'm not just talking about user interface design or graphic design or product design. I'm talking about something deeper than that. I'm talking about designing the entire process by which we operate our business. My favorite definition of design comes from Herbert Simon, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and very early researcher into AI. And as such, he was trying to understand, well, how do humans function? What do we do, and how do we think about things? Well, one of the things we do is we design stuff. Well, what does that mean? And he offered this deceptively simple but very powerful definition of design, which is anything we do for the purpose of changing existing situations into preferred ones. And this is great because it starts with the idea that what we're trying to do is to change and innovate and make things better. And the really interesting word to me is the word preferred, because we're not talking about engineering solutions that are complete or correct or ultimate or finished. All we're trying to do is figure out where we think we want to go next. And as soon as we get there, preferred suddenly becomes existing, and then we have to start all over again. So it gives us this image of a never-ending process of trying to make our situations and trying to make our lives better. And so in this new digital world, we need a new way to think about IT. And I've become more and more dissatisfied with even the idea of information technology, because I don't think managing information is what we do anymore. What's happening is IT is becoming the mechanism by which companies interact with their customers and the way that employees interact with each other. So I've started thinking of it in terms of interaction technology. And what we need is for IT to become a medium like water for fish that allows this process of continuous design and continuous navigation and continuous co-creation with the market to happen in a very fluid, frictionless way. Now, we hear a lot these days about velocity. This idea that the company that can deliver change more quickly and continuously can defeat its competitors in the marketplace. But that's only half the equation. It isn't enough, for example, to just make your OODA loop tighter than the other guys. And in fact, if you study the work of John Boyd, who was a military strategist who developed this concept of a very continuous operational loop for military activities, he wasn't just concerned with how the military could make decisions faster. He was more concerned with how the military could continually reinterpret and re-understand an environment that was characterized by change and uncertainty and unknowability. And if you think about the nature of war and geopolitics in the 21st century, that was a prescient way to think about things. So what we need is a model of control that's much more conversational. Now, the word conversation literally means switching back and forth. And this means that we speak, or we act, or we deliver something to the market, and then we have to listen to the response, and we have to understand that response, and the next thing we do has to connect to it. Otherwise, we're just engaging in a series of non sequiturs. And in order to make this work, we need the ability to empathize. Now, this word empathy has a lot of definitions and a lot of connotations, and there's a certain amount of controversy these days over what it means and how applicable it is. But I use it in a very simple way. That empathy is the ability to see things as if from another's perspective. And I have used it in the context in particular of DevOps, that it's about developers being able to see the results of their actions as if from operations perspective. So it works on my laptop, may be fine for me, but what is that going to look like from operations perspective? Or file a ticket and wait 3 weeks and we'll give you a server for your test environment may be ideal from operations perspective, but what does it look like from the development organization's perspective? And in order to operate an empathy-based digital business, we have to design for service and not just software. We have to shift out of this product mentality to a broader service-oriented mentality. We have to start by empathizing with our customers and their goals. We have to design for the entirety of the customer experience with our organization. And we have to design for our employees' experience in exactly the same way. For me, the primary critique that I have of things like Agile and DevOps and Lean UX is they have a tendency to be focused on delivering features. And at the end of the day, there's still this kind of assembly line, push it out the door perspective. And they miss the larger customer experience and the larger employee experience that's needed to actually operate those features and those services. And we need to understand that the service economy is different. Service is different, and it's different in ways that may be more profound than we realize. Service value is not something that you pour into an object and hand to a customer in exchange for money. Service value doesn't fully manifest until people actually use your service. The fact that you operate an airport and you have runways and airplanes and security gates and coffee shops doesn't do anyone any good until someone shows up and tries to fly to another city. And when they do, they bring with them their particular needs and moods and experiences, and those intersect with your service systems and with your employees' needs and moods and experiences. And the value actually arises in that intersection. And that has the effect of taking the sausage factory of operations, which traditionally has been hidden behind the scenes, the back office as it were, and bringing it forward and surfacing it and making it an explicit part of the value equation. So as I discovered with my health insurance experience, that all of the internal aspects and dysfunctions of the organization directly affected the quality of my experience. So, how do we design for service? How do we operate for service? Well, we have to start to turn our attention outward and upwards from ourselves and what we do, and start to focus on our customers and their larger goals and needs. It's interesting because, ironically, perhaps the best definition of service I've encountered comes from ITIL. ITIL talks a lot about service management and service operations and so on and so forth, but they start out by trying to define the word service, and they do a wonderful job of it with this phrase of facilitating desirable outcomes. What's important is not the CRM system that you've built and operate. What's important is what the sales force can accomplish with the help of that CRM system and with the help of you building and operating it. And something that's critical, and I think from my perspective the most important thing I'm going to say here, is that it's service all the way down. Your company is a service provider. Your HR and IT departments are service providers. Your design and development and operations and QA and support teams are service providers. Your microservices and microservice teams are service providers. At every level of your organization, it is no longer enough to just do what you do. I manage the Linux box. I pull tickets off a queue, whatever it may be. Instead, it's everyone's job to help each other create larger value, and by extension, to help your customers create larger value. So this all sounds nice. It's a great and wonderful world. I think it would be good to live in it. But we're still in business, and so we still have to think about things like efficiency and quality and ultimately profitability, because that's why we're here. Well, you could say that in this new world of complexity and emergence that we find ourselves in, the ability to steer your way through change and uncertainty is the new efficiency. If you're in a canoe and you paddle a couple of times and then you sit back and relax, what happens is you get blown off course by currents and winds, and then you have to go paddle, 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 paddle to get back on course, which is very wasteful. Whereas instead, if you are continuously steering, you are continuously optimizing your ability to respond to the market and to tune what you're delivering and how you're delivering it. So we need to approach everything we do from the perspective of minimizing friction and maximizing feedback. We have to understand that these two are inseparable, and in fact, we do the first in order to enable the second. And this is really the essence of lean startup, of lean UX, of design thinking, of agile, of DevOps. And we have to avoid this temptation to fall back into the industrial model where we're thinking about how fast can we push stuff out the door, how can we crank up our velocity, because we end up just trying to roll rocks downhill faster, which is not really what we need. It's not really how we steer. Now, when failure is inevitable and unavoidable, that means that we have to stop trying to engineer it out of existence. And instead, we have to try and engineer in the ability to survive it and ideally even flourish in the face of it. I do a really fun exercise when I do my workshop with designers. I ask them to do a design for failure exercise where I say, okay, imagine that you are designing a user experience where someone is going through a fairly complicated process of browsing for a product, picking the product, putting it in their shopping cart, checking out, and buying it. And it's fairly long and drawn out, and they've gone through a lot of decisions to get there. And right before they're ready to push the button that says, I want to buy it, the system's database crashes catastrophically. It goes completely offline. What do? What happens to the user experience? And it's interesting because designers spend a lot of time designing for failure in the sense of how do we prevent users from making mistakes that will hurt them? How do we prevent them using the user interface to make sure that they could push the confirm button before they delete a file or something like that? But, like the rest of us, they tend to assume that the systems underneath the experience will always be there. And so they don't know how to think about, well, what if the systems aren't there? Furthermore, if failure is not only unavoidable but unpredictable, it means that we can't just sit back and design for what we know. We have to actually go out and look for failure. We know it's there. If it surfaces, now we have more information, and now we can design for it, and now we can learn from it. You know, Netflix has this thing called the Chaos Monkey. And what the Chaos Monkey does is it goes out in production during the day when people are watching movies and intentionally shuts things off. Turns off database instances, it kills servers, it introduces latency into networks, and it actually intentionally tries to break stuff. The really interesting thing is that Netflix senior management doesn't consider it a success when Chaos Monkey runs and there's no user impact. The opposite, they consider it a success when there is something that breaks that affects users. The reason for that is because now they have information they didn't have before. That failure was there, it was going to happen sometime. Now we have a hold of it. Now we can lasso it, and now we can actually design it out of existence. We can build something for it. So if we take all of these scenarios seriously, it means that we have to start to let go of the whole idea of being done, of figuring it out, of getting it right, of winning. The reason we do things like service design, for example, is not so that we can create this beautiful customer journey map and print it out on a big expensive plotter and put it up on the wall where everyone can admire it. We do it in order to continuously understand how do our customers want to interact with us, and how does that interaction change over time. And in order to do this, we have to start to use operations as input to design. Traditionally, operations is the place you don't want to hear from. Silence is golden. It means that things are working, or at least it means that customer support is holding people's frustration at bay. But there's this priceless, when we talk about failure and recovery and information, operations and support has priceless information about the reality of our customers' experience, and we need to flip things on their head and start to listen to that and use it as input. And we need to treat empathy as something that we continuously seek. If you look at some of the design thinking infographics, they seem to represent this linear process. And it looks like you empathize at the beginning and then you're done with that. And then you go off and do other stuff. The truth is that you can never perfectly empathize, because if you could, you would actually be that other person. You would actually be your customer. And so instead, you need to be continuously tuning your ability to understand what it is that they need and what it is that you've missed about what they need. I was thinking about this word release. In ITIL, we talk about release management. In DevOps, we talk about deployment and continuous delivery and things like that. And I realized that the word is much more poetic than we give it credit for, because when you release something, you really are releasing it out into the wild and losing control over it. And I don't know about you, but my experience has always been that no matter how good I get something, no matter how right it is, no matter how few bugs it is, what happens is customers get a hold of it and they use it and they say, wow, this is wonderful, thank you so much. Now, if it could only do this. And they inevitably take it in a direction that I can't foresee. And so we have to think about release as the beginning rather than the end of the process, and approach it with a level of humility and curiosity of, well, what's going to happen next that I didn't expect, and how can I respond to it? So what all of this means is that the role of management changes. And it becomes, again, not about separating things out and managing them independently, but bringing them together. I was at a DevOps conference recently, and somebody gave a provocative and humorous talk, And they made a semi-facetious statement where they said, DevOps does away with middle management, which I thought was a little unfortunate. And luckily, during the Q&A period, someone raised their hand and said, well, I'm a middle manager, and I'm not out of a job. So I asked him, well, what is your job? And he said, my job is to foster communication. And I thought this was really fantastic. It was a really new and powerful view that we're not talking about getting rid of management, we're talking about changing how we approach it. That the problem with silos is not that things are separate. DevOps or Lean UX or whatever you want to call it isn't about making everybody report to the same VP. I have clients where you're not allowed to use the word DevOps because the ops directors think it means that they'll be out of a job. What it means, the problem with silos is they can't breathe. They can't connect together in order to create larger value and larger benefit. You know, I've had the great luck in my career to work for some really excellent service agencies, both in IT and design, and been around people who deeply understood what it meant to truly empathize with their customers and to understand what they really needed at a particular time and to go beyond our expectations of what we were supposed to be doing. And as a result, they were able to add greater value. They were able to create entire new lines of business because we had new insights. They were able to actually start to dissolve the boundaries between themselves and their customers. So when people ask me things like, well, can you do Agile or DevOps or design thinking across organizational silos? Can you do it with outsourced vendors? Can you do it with offshoring? To me, that's not really the essential question. To me, the essential question is, how do we begin to shift our focus from this is who I am, this is how I'm structured, this is what I make, this is what I do, to this is how I help. So, we're faced with this brave new world. How do we get from here to there? Now, to some degree, this is entirely what business has become about, is how do we change existing into preferred? But we need a way to move from where we are to where we want to try and get, where we need to get as digital businesses in a complex world. So, to illustrate this, I want to tell a quick story about a building. This is the Leadenhall building in central London. The reason it's shaped like a triangle is because it's prohibited by law from obscuring the view of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I had the bright idea, we'll make it triangular, we can make it as high as we want, and it won't get in the way. But there was a problem. Skyscrapers are more profitable as you go up the building. You can charge more per square foot on the 10th floor than the first floor. So they essentially minimize the profitability of the building. And given that it's a very expensive building, you can imagine that the client wasn't very happy with that. So they came up with a solution. Traditionally in skyscrapers, the service systems, bathrooms, elevators, plumbing, electrical, run in a big shaft down the middle of the building. And what they did was they took that shaft and moved it to one side and narrowed it and actually lowered prefab systems down from the top using cranes. And as a result, they were able to minimize the amount of lost saleable space. That created its own problem, which is it made the building off-center and gave it a leaning Tower of Pisa effect. So the way they solved that was they built the building in sections with steel cables between the sections, and after it was built, they actually used the cables to torque it back to true and inserted giant flat steel shims in between the sections of the building so it would stand up straight. The point of the story is they were surrounded by constraints. You can't because. And instead of giving up, they treated those constraints as creative problem-solving opportunities. And as a result, they were able to steer their way to a solution that not only satisfied the technical and business requirements, not only created a unique original building, but completely revolutionized the process of skyscraper design and construction. And so we are also all faced with constraints. We can't because. We can't because we run the core of our business on a 40-year-old mainframe. We can't because we have to deal with regulation and compliance. We can't because we're not Netflix. We're not unicorns. Netflix is different from us. Well, the truth of the matter is they're not. Netflix didn't start out as a digital business. They started out burning CDs and stuffing them in envelopes and shipping them out through the mail. And they started out with a very traditional IT stack. They had their own data centers. They had big, expensive Oracle databases. They had monolithic J2EE applications. And they actually spent 7 years, bit by bit, migrating to this very radical new industry-leading architecture and organization. So we can design our own transformations. We don't have to know everything in advance. We don't have to put together a 5-year plan and then go execute on that 5-year plan in Taylorist style. And in fact, in a world of complexity, we can't, because we can't predict what we're going to find, so we have to navigate our way as we go. One of the things that always gets me is that when people talk about doing an agile transformation and then they do it in a completely waterfall way. And it's like, wait, you have this wonderful thing right in front of you. Use it. It's interesting that Netflix and Etsy, which are two of the supposed unicorns in the new digital business world, don't do everything the same as each other. They actually have debates about how to do continuous delivery and how to manage code and how to do microservices or even whether to do microservices. And their differences are a reflection of their particular histories and cultures and businesses. So when we look around us at new ways of doing things, we need to treat them as signposts and not destinations. Because not only can we design our own transformation, we have to. The point of the exercise is not whether you run microservices or whether you run containers or whether you have 2 pizza-sized teams or anything like that. That is in a constant state of flux. It's interesting, a couple of years ago, everyone was saying you need to use Chef to manage your data center in order to automate things. And if you have Chef, you can get rid of all your admins and blah, 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 blah. And now people are saying, forget Chef, you don't need Chef, you just need Docker. And it's like, wait a minute, how did we get here? I've read really interesting posts. I think it was LinkedIn. It was either LinkedIn or Uber. And they published this post about how a number of years ago, and I can't actually remember which direction, but it doesn't matter for the story. They switched from MySQL to Postgres. And they did it for a series of reasons. And then they published this post about how now we're switching back from Postgres to MySQL. And you might say, well, someone should get fired because someone just wasted a bunch of time and money and energy. But the reason they're switching back is because their needs changed. It was the right decision at the time, and it's the right decision now. And what they understand is that change is part of what they do, and it's part of what they have to know how to do. So, in closing, I think what I'm trying to say here is that this idea of design, of continuously changing and figuring out how to change existing into preferred, is something that we all have to have the ability to do. And the ability to learn and the ability to adapt and the ability to improve at every level of the organization across disciplines becomes what the operations of the company actually are. So thank you very much. And as Jens mentioned, if you're interested in exploring more about things like continuous design, my book is available on Amazon and elsewhere. There are also a bunch of 50% off discount coupons at the Zipgate booth right around the corner here. And I'm also available for consulting, and I love traveling to Germany, and I love working in Germany. It's funny because I first came to Germany 3 years ago to speak at a conference, and I'd never been before, and I didn't really know anything about it, so I thought I better do some research. So I went online and I researched doing business in Germany, and I found all of these dire warnings. Germans are very formal and they're very serious, so don't tell jokes. And I was like, oh. So I was kind of worried. And I have found, and maybe I've gone to the right places or the wrong places, but I have found Germans to be the most friendly and helpful and relaxed and humorful people.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I think we're going to have a Q&A session right now. And who has questions for Jeff?
So first thing that comes to my mind is I'm just thinking, because I'm reading the book, about the role of the site reliability engineer. Do you have a definition from your view, from your talk for that, maybe? More the infrastructure thing than the product thing? And how it interacts inside the company?
That's a hard question because there's a lot of debate about that right now. There are smart people in the DevOps world who say that site reliability engineering as a separate discipline is a bad thing and should be done away with. And they're very upset with Google for publishing their book about that. I think what they're trying to say is Google at least used to have this model where while a software product was maturing, the development organization had to run it. And at some point it would reach kind of a steady state and then you could kind of hand it off. And I think what people are seeing more and more, and certainly the Facebook model of eternal development, or perpetual development, is that it never finishes changing. So again, you'll hear these talk about things like full stack engineers, which is this idea that the engineer who can do everything from CSS all the way down to configuring a router. I don't believe in full stack engineers. And I don't believe that you need full stack engineers. What you need are people who work closely together and can collaborate and empathize with each other. I think it's perfectly fine to have someone who is a Linux rock star, and that's what they do for a living. I worked with a guy a number of years ago. His thing was he knew everything there was to know about IE6 CSS bugs and how to code around them. And he worked in a cross-functional team, and he was a very strong contributor. That was his thing. It happened to be that at that point in time, it was really important to know that stuff. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about it anymore. So I think what I'm trying to say is, from my perspective, it's perfectly fine to have people who specialize. And I also think it's perfectly fine to have groups that specialize. It's perfectly fine to have a site reliability group and a UX group and a QA group. The key is, how do they work with each other on a daily basis? Thank you very much for having me.